With patch 10.1.7 becoming a release candidate build in the PTR, as well as patch 10.2 being added to the encrypted build for Blizzard, we are getting close to a new season. By now it will be 1 to 2 weeks at best until we start getting some news or even directly 10.2 into the PTR, which is when we will start seeing some of the ideas that Blizzard has for the next patch. We can ask ourselves, perhaps even try to guess or even hope what we want to see in the next season. And this can be whatever you want. It could be wanting to see more balance, for example, in Mythic Plus or in the raid. This is a very easy thing to guess for. Maybe it's something that has to do with professions, perhaps maybe even with gearing. Maybe you didn't like the way we are gearing so fast, or perhaps you might want to see, for example, the classic request of wanting the catalyst being open earlier. Maybe your wish is for the dungeons in the dungeon pool of Mythic Plus, etc, etc. So, as we get close to this new patch, what could we be wishing for? Let's start with the controversial one first, okay? Let's get the controversy and the debate out of the way. This is something I mentioned before, and clearly not many players enjoy this take, which is the fact that I believe right now we are getting too much item level too quickly. I wish for us in 10.2 to be gearing up with the crest system a little bit more slowly. So to not be 1 to 2 item levels below the max in like 3 weeks. That is perhaps a little bit too fast. I would like for it to be a bit more staggered over time, to allow Blizzard to be able to balance, for example, bosses with the increase of item level in mind of the player base. It makes it easier for them to balance. It prevents possible problems of creating a raid that gets cleared very quickly, for example, because you don't have a power progression of your characters, of your players over time, and it creates problems later on, right? Because one of the things you remember from all the raids is the fact that 1 month, 2 months, 3 months into the tier, all those bosses are getting progressively weaker because you keep getting improvements, upgrades, better loot over time. Meanwhile, this tier hasn't been like that at all. The Neltharion of today or the Neltharion of 2 months ago are the exact same unless Blizzard nerfed the encounter, because basically 2 months ago players were 445 item levels and now players are 446 item levels, so not too much has changed. That's my first wish for 10.2, to stagger out the growth of item level a little bit in the patch. Then we move from the controversy of this take to something that will be much more enjoyed, which is the catalyst, right? We have been in a situation ever since Shadowlands introduced the catalyst where we had to wait approximately 6 weeks, also known as 1.5 months, before the catalyst comes out. According to many players, I would put myself inside this group of players as well, it's a little bit too much. 6 weeks, basically it's too much to wait for pretty much every Hall of Fame caliber player, because they will be done with progression before they even have the chance to use the catalyst, as well as it will, slow down all the players, for example, who don't raid. They will basically have to be weaker than raid players because they won't have nearly as much of an access to the tier unless they are lucky and they get a whole bunch of options for the tier from the vault. So I think cutting it down from 6 weeks wait time to 4 weeks wait time, which is a month, is already a good start. We might even bring it down to about 3 weeks of wait time. That would be perhaps the sweet spot in how long should we wait for the catalyst, but definitely not to be waiting as long as 6 weeks, as we have gotten basically for the past 3 tiers when it comes to the catalyst. Then we have a request, which is not, particularly of mine, but more like looking around the community when it comes to this type of problem that some players might have, which is the cost of the crafting. crafting things can be, in particular at the beginning of a season, it can be somewhat pricey. It's not that uncommon having to pay several hundreds of thousands of gold to get your crafted items online early on in a season. We are also in a season where it's quite easy to level up characters and gear them up very quickly, so you might even find yourself having to gear up with crafted items a couple of characters, maybe even 3 characters, and the cost. The cost of these crafted items can get to be quite high nowadays. So you often hear some of the requests or the wishes from the player base to try for Blizzard to lower down the cost of these crafting materials, and that doesn't even include the cost, for example, of potions in particular. Not as much the food or the flasks, which this expansion have been acceptable, more so the potions, which even now, very late into a tier, can cost you 100 to 150 gold every use, and earlier on in the season we were talking about over 500 gold per use of a single potion, which, it's quite on the pricey side. That could also be a good wish to have fulfilled for 10.2. Talking about in-game features, not much to hope for about the raid. Usually Blizzard is on lockdown with developing raid bosses and raid fights. We do have something we have touched on before, the difficulty of certain mechanics, perhaps wishing that we don't get other similar complicated features like the Hearts of Neltharion, which are going to do not much other than giving you a headache with add-ons and weak auras in trying to figure them out. What we might be looking forward towards is Mythic Plus, as well as the new dungeon pool of Mythic Plus. As of right now, we know we are getting a couple of the current Dragonflight dungeons together with the Mega Dungeon split in half, as we have gotten in previous expansions, as well as 4 older dungeons once more. One of the wishes, rather than just wishing for a particular dungeon, like, oh, I really hope we get, the Mechanar as a Mythic Plus dungeon, or I really hope we get Grim Battle as a Mythic Plus dungeon, the wish is to not have certain dungeons be plagued by a must-have utility toolkit of certain specs like we have gotten this season. Of course, all eyes are pointed at Priest, all eyes are pointed at features like Master Spell and features like Mind Suit. Try to have a more comprehensive dungeon pool where you don't really feel like you are locked already 1 spot out of 5 with a particular spec or class, because they just bring a must-have, a must-use type of utility, as opposed to what we got this season in Season 2. If we went back to Season 1, where Master Spell, for example, wasn't nearly as necessary, it would be much better for the health of the game, of the balance in Mythic Plus. So besides the PvE activities, the gear you use in those PvE activities, as well as the cost of crafting the gear or crafting the consumables for these activities, of course, one of the other requests that many players will have, and it will be, as usual, the most diverse in the game, is when it comes to balancing, when it comes to the power of each spec. Mostly because all players of each and every one of the 38 specs would just be wishing that their spec becomes the powerful one. So we have the most amount of diversity in here. Now, obviously, we already know we are going to get some changes to discipline, as well as reworks to all 3 rogue specs. That's basically the one thing we have confirmed for 10.2. Obviously, talking about balance, we are quite in a hot topic at the moment because of the state of Mythic Plus and the power of 5 particular specs. Of course, at the moment, the simplest and the easiest of the wishes is to, go back, even just go back to what we had in Season 1, a couple of tanks being viable rather than just 1, 3 healers being viable rather than just 1, and a collection of 6 or 7 even DPS specs being viable instead of just 3. That would be a good start, right? Going back to what we had in Season 1 of Dragonflight, or even Season 2 before patch 10.1.5 warped the meta so much. to be honest, even talking for myself, I'm starting to get even somewhat nostalgic. You know, I don't remember the last time I was in a dungeon with, for example, a hunter, or for example, a warrior, or for example, something like a rogue. It's been weeks now, multiple weeks and even months for a spec like Priest of seeing these same specs over and over. So even just for the variety, even just for a change of pace, seeing multiple specs, getting to play with multiple specs and their toolkits would be just a breath of fresh air compared to likely what we will keep having for the next couple of months before the patch comes out. We will have been for about 3.5 months stuck with seeing the same 3 DPS specs, for example, for so long. So one of the more heartfelt wishes in 10.2 is for Blizzard to be able to balance the meta enough that Mythic Plus becomes a little bit more varied once more. Of course, this issue will be filled with plenty of question marks, especially when it comes to one particular spec in this comp, which is Augmentation, which is a much harder spec to balance compared to the other members of the Exodia comp because of how unique they are and the unique things they can bring as a DPS spec to a party. But, you know, we are talking about hopes here. We're talking about what we wish to see in 10.2 in Season 3, so that is definitely one of the main wishes as well when it comes to seeing a more diverse pool of specs in Mythic Plus. So far, I think this covers all of the main wishes for the patch. A slightly lower down rate of acquisition of your gear, a slightly faster opening of the catalyst, a slightly more even and balanced pool of Mythic Plus dungeons without too many mechanics requiring must-have classes, more balanced classes for Mythic Plus, as well as a more laid-back cost of crafting gear and crafting consumables in 10.2. So, of course, outside of these main takes, let me guys know what are your other takes, your other wishes for 10.2, maybe something that wasn't mentioned at all in this list of wishes for the next patch. Besides this, we are now leaving each other on this Sunday. We can start the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which as usual can still be given for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these alternative things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, it happened. At the very least now we are about 10 degrees lower than the rest of this week. So, it's getting chiller, finally.